Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome as we continue our study in Unit 1 titled Creation and the Whole Bible. You'll remember what last week was about as we started this unit off. I said the Creator, God the Creator, that's right. We'll just give Opal just a minute to get a seat there and then we'll continue on. Last week we began this unit of study with the book of Genesis and the lesson, God the Creator. We learned last week that God has always existed. God is distinct from creation. God provides the necessities for life. That the order and design of creation reveals God's glory. That God has placed upon humanity the responsibility to reign over creation. And lastly, God knows us deeply and completely. And that's just a few things that we hit on last week and studied on. But first and foremost, we learned that there is one true God who is the sovereign creator of all things in heaven and on earth. And that's what we started out with this unit of study about creation in the whole Bible. This week we'll explore how God cares for His creation. I think we all agree that the Bible is the foundational narrative for Christian faith and practice. Everybody here agree with that? You know, it tells the story of God's creating the heavens and the earth and of God's loving care in the redeeming of a fallen people and restoring creation to its pristine beauty so that it can once again glorify His creation. Simply put, it gives us a glimpse of God's relation with creation, God's relation with animals, humans' relation with creation, and creation's relation with the Creator. We can find all of this in the Bible, God's Word. You know, as Job will soon learn in this lesson today, God created the universe, God owns the creation, God loves the creation, God values the creation, and God redeems the creation. You know, in this lesson we will observe Job as he is confronted by God about his creation, by the God of creation. You know, Job has been posing questions as we move into this, we'll see, that may be legitimate. His questions may be legitimate, but somewhat irreverent and almost accusatory of God. In answering him, however, God put Job in his place, so to speak. Many times He has to put us in our place, reminding Job that he is one of God's creatures, not the all-knowing, all-powerful, and sovereign Creator. I think sometimes we put ourselves above the Creator. We forget from where we came. It is not God the Creator of all creation, nor is He equal. You know, let's look to our opening activity and the question posed by it. Have you ever seen a piece of complex machinery with dozens of moving parts all moving at this precise moment, so fast that the natural eye cannot keep up with it? You ever seen any machinery like that? What complex piece of machinery can you name that makes you wonder how it works and who owns it? Dorothy said a sewing machine. That's good, because if you sit and think about it, I would like to talk to somebody that created it and, you know, thought about it and how to put it together, because it would blow my mind just to look at it. Yeah, just the machines that make the machinery that we're talking about are even beyond our apprehension of how they put it all together. How any mind could even come up with such a contraption of such. You know, some that I think of when I think about it, especially living in this area, look at the combines or the cotton pickers and all the different things they have to do. I think, my gracious, how did anybody make one of those things? Another thing I would kind of think about would be the computers, the cell phones, and all the parts they have in there and how they put it together to where it sends this signal and does all these different things and all this going on at once. It's beyond me. Just think of our military and some of the equipment they have. Can you imagine what it took to go into maybe the fighter jets and the different things that they can do and how all the things are working through there? I wouldn't even want to look at the panel of one of them. I'd be lost just looking at it. You wouldn't want me to try and control it. You know, our lesson brings to mind the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. with all its inventions. Has anybody ever been there? You ever been to it? The Smithsonian Institute with all of its. Fred said he's been there. It's in Washington, D.C., you know, but think of all of its inventions and the inventors the inventions that were so spectacular that you can't help but wonder how their inventors came to make them. It's beyond us. And much as it was with Job as he observed God's creation. You know, put yourself in Job's shoes. Let's just do that a second. Put yourself in his shoes. What question would you ask God about his creation as a creature of creation who is confronted each day with his handiwork, which many times renders you speechless? What question would you ask God about his creation? Anybody? Is there anything you'd like to ask God about his creation?
If I had a question, I would be really honored because if I can see the things that are here, that God will see to us direction. I would be really honored just to follow. I pray, I keep going, I keep going until we need to come. I watched a farm auction last night. John Deere make the tractor a 21 to 2 to 3 years old, sold for $560,000. 3 and 4 years old. A tractor that these farmers use now. $550,000. No telling what it costs brand new.
You know it's got to do something then. For somebody to pay that for it. Goodness. You know, there's many things we would probably, if faced before God, would think to ask him. You know, sometimes we may, with things like they are in the world today, a lot of people would probably ask, why, God, did you let us suffer? Why, God, is the world like it is? Yeah, Rose said, why do you put up with it? It's something she would probably ask, you know. You can do something about it, why not change it, we would ask, being humans. And those are just some things that we would ask God. You know, overall, I believe this lesson will help us come to the realization that God created it all. He owns it all. He controls it all. And as we look at 1 Chronicles 29:11, if you'd like to go there and read with me. It says, thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all. And that's something we should always remember. You want a verse to remember, that's a good one. 1 Chronicles 29:11. It kind of puts us in our place. You know, when we think about it, and after we read that, it says, Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty for all that is in heaven and on earth. You're exalted above all. Really something to remember. We are just a mere fraction of His creation. I think where we get in trouble is when we forget this. Sometimes we forget that we're just a mere fraction of His creation. You know, this as much as Job in a sense did, as we will go into this lesson today, which takes us to part 1 of the lesson. God governs heaven and earth. Here Job is challenged to explain the creation. Would you want that task? I don't think I would. I would not want to stand before God and have to explain His creation. We're going to be over in Job 38, and I'm going to start with verses 1 through 3 in just a few seconds. But as we know, as we'll look at this here in Job 38, God asked Job a series of questions, as we'll soon find out, that were designed basically to bring Job to his senses and to lead him to humility. These are questions meant to make Job stop in his path and take note of God's creation and his lack of understanding of that creation. Job 38, 1 through 3 is where we'll start at here. It says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Now, if we look at that in the Christian Standard Bible, it reads, Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. He said, Who is this who obscures my counsel with ignorant words? Get ready to answer me like a man. When I question you, you will inform me. You know, God is speaking here to Job from the whirlwind. This doesn't mean that it's from a windstorm such as that destroyed Job's children in Job 1, 18 and 19, and it's not the winds of judgment that are found in Job 21 and 18. It was a theophany or a manifestation of God Himself. As we can see as we look over to 2 Kings 2:11, which speaks of a similar instance there. It says, And it came to pass as they went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. You know, this whirlwind is not just a storm that all of a sudden come up on. A lot of times we're surprised with storms. Can you imagine the surprise of this whirlwind to Job? Totally different than just our everyday storm, because it was a manifestation of God Himself. You know, although Job may have been upright and he was not suffering because of wrongdoing at this point, his frequent complaints against God were equivalent to assuming the Lord's prerogatives, playing God in his life, is what we see here. Job needed to be reminded who the Lord is in order to find Him sufficient for his situation at this time. God did not challenge Job's integrity, but He did question his knowledge here. As we look at verse 2, as he said here, Who is this who obscures my counsel with ignorant words? So he challenged his knowledge of what he had created. Job had questioned God's just governance of the world and proposed that he could talk with God as an equal. The Lord addressed Job, however, by challenging him to enter into a dialogue in full possession of his human strength and faculties. Okay, you're going to question me? Let's hear it. What have you got to say about how I created things? Who are you to challenge the one who created it? He tells him there in verse 3 to basically get ready to answer. It renders the Hebrew, gird up your loins, as in the King James Version. You know, Job's difficult task now consisted of fully understanding and answering God's questions. He wanted to meet with God. He wanted to challenge God. Now he gets the chance. As we look next, we move on now to verses 18 through 30. I'm going to break them down and read them a few at a time here. It's easier to kind of go through it and understand it. Let's look first at Job 38, verses 16 through 18. It says, Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked the search of the depths? Have the gates of death been opened unto thee, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. I'm going to read that here from the Christian Standard Bible, which it asks here. It says, Have you traveled the sources of the sea, or walked in the depths of the oceans? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the extent of the earth? Tell me if you know all of this. Now this is God speaking to Job here. He's asking him this question. You know, the extent of Job's experiential knowledge is questioned here. His limited travels cannot have included going to the hidden springs that lie in the depth of the ocean. He couldn't go there. If you think about it, if it's in the depths of the ocean, in those days they didn't have scuba gear or anything else. How would he have breathed while he was down there? You know, Job had not seen even the shadow of the gates of death, let alone pass through it. The point is that Job, with his limited perspective, should trust in He who is infinite in wisdom, power, and knowledge. And that's the whole point here. He should be trusting God, who is all wise, has all the knowledge, and created everything. He understands it because he created it. As we look next to verses 19 through 21, I'm going to read this from the Christian Standard Bible. If you've got your King James, it'll just help you understand and break it down here. It says, Where is the road to the home of light? Do you know where darkness lives, so you can lead it back to its border? Are you familiar with the path to its home? Don't you know you were already born? Or don't you know you were already born? Light and darkness are personified here, each having a home here, from which they daily emerge and return. The Lord reminded Job that he had not even been born when God commanded the first light to penetrate the darkness. You weren't even here when I created it. What do you know about it? As I said, it looks here as if God is placing him in his place, reminding him who was first, who created it, and knows all. As we look at verses 22 through 23, it says, Have you entered the place where the snow is stored? Or have you seen the storehouses of hell, which I hold in reserve for times of trouble, for the day of warfare and battle? What road leads to the place where light is dispersed? Where is the source of the east wind that spreads across the earth? And he's asking all of these things. Where is all of this? Have you seen it? Do you know where it's stored? The imagery of these verses basically views God as keeping snow and hell and heavenly storehouses for his use at the appropriate time. And since that's how he put it here, he asked him, do you know where it's stored? And if he did, he couldn't do anything with it. He can't control it. Well, Biden and anybody else that thinks that is wrong. They don't control this world. They may control their actions, but they'll also pay for their actions if they're against God. That goes for anybody. You know, God could use these as a weapon if he wanted to, as can be seen in, I think it's over in Exodus 9:18 through 26, which I'm not going to take time to read it, but you can look at that in Psalm 68:14 and several other verses that you can go to that speaks of these and how he could use it even as weapons. The hail, the snow, and different things. No, verse 24 says, what road leads to the place where light is dispersed? Where is the source of the east wind that spreads across the earth? That's the next question he's asking Job here. Can anybody tell me where it is? Fred said it's in God's hand. You know, God reminded Job that his knowledge did not include the distribution of lightning. He reminds him of all this stuff. You don't control all of this. Or the place where the east wind originated. Such a mighty desert wind had swept away Job's family in Job 1:19. But he didn't even know from which direction that wind come. I think he's really showing Job here just how little he knows about the creation. And that he really has no control of it. Verses 25 through 27. Who cuts a channel for the flooding rain, or clears the way for lightning, to bring rain on an uninhabited land, on a desert with no human life, to satisfy the parched wasteland and cause the grass to sprout? You know, think about it. Who does all of that? Who cuts a channel for the flooding rain to go down, to water such things? Who can cause grass to sprout in the desert? You know, when we think of this, humans would never bring rain on uninhabited land. We'd be doing good to even get water there because it's so far out. How are you going to get any water out there? Only God has the wisdom to make it rain in the desert, giving evidence of his wise care for the entire world. It doesn't matter where it is. If he wants it to rain, it'll rain. If he wants a drought, there will be a drought. You know, this gives evidence of his wise care for the entire world. Next, we look over to, let's see, verses 28 through 30. Does the rain have a father? Who fathered the drops of dew? Whose womb did the ice come from? Who gave birth to the frost of heaven? When water becomes as hard as stone, and the surface of the watery depths is frozen. You know, God reminded Job that only a master craftsman could do so. You know, only a master craftsman could account for the manifold forms that water can assume in the places where these may be found. That master craftsman is who? God himself. It is all under God's control. True. You know, it tells us in Job 5 and 10, it says, he giveth rain upon the earth and sendeth water upon the field. It is God who does such. You know, all of the questions God posed to Job point to the greatness of God and the complete dependence of humanity upon God when you look at all of this. We are dependent upon God. Today in our modern world, we have much greater insight in these natural phenomena. Kind of like I was talking about now, they can go a lot deeper in the oceans because they have the gear to do it. But they still cannot go so deep or to the depths of the ocean that they know all that God has given in place to it. There are still things to be explored that they'll never know. But God knows because he created it. You know, our answers to the deep questions of the universe are woefully inadequate to fully explain what God has made, no matter what we have in science or any other thing throughout time. We still are not able to explain what God has made in complete form and fashion. We're only human. We are only creatures of the creation, not the Creator. We go to part 1b of our lesson, where Job is now challenged to explain the wonders of heaven. God has already challenged him to explain the wonders of the earth. Now he wants him to explain the wonders of the heavens. That's going to be in Job 38, verses 31 through 38. It says, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazorah in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof over the earth? Canst thou lift up the voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? Canst thou send lightnings, that they may go and say unto thee, Here we are? Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, or who hath given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds by wisdom, or who can stay the bottles of heaven? When the dust groweth into hardness, and the clods flee fast together. Who can do all of this, he basically is asking Job. You know, as we look at Job 38 and 31, he said there, can you fasten the chains of Pleiades, or loosen the belt of Orion? We can't, but God can. As we look at Job 5 and 8, Amos 5 and 8, excuse me. It says, seek him that maketh the seven stars and Orion, and turneth the shadow of death into the morning, and maketh the day dark and night, who calleth for the waters of the sea, and poureth them out upon the face of the earth. The Lord is his name. So it straight out tells us there, and as if we look over to Isaiah 40:26, it says, lift up your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created these things, who bringeth out their host by number. He calleth them all by names, by the greatness of his might, for he is strong in power, not one who faileth. He even calls them by name. You know, God turned Job's attention here to the constellations, the Pleiades, the Orion, and the Bear. Job had mentioned them earlier in connection with God's creative activity in Job 9 and 9. The meaning of the term constellation is really uncertain and may include the planets. As we look at 2 Kings 23 and 5, it says, and he put down the idolatrous priest whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah and in the places round about Jerusalem, those who were burned incense unto Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and the planets, and to all the host of heaven. All the things God has created. Not to be worshipped, only God is to be worshipped. You know, although Job knew of their existence, of all of these things, these stars, the sun, and everything else, he did not understand the laws of physics and astronomy and their effect on the earth. He knew about them, we know about them. But do we truly understand them? Even with all the science, we do not truly understand all the things out there that God has created in the atmosphere. God alone exercises dominion over all of this. He goes on in verse 34 to ask him, he says, can you command the clouds so that the flood of water covers you? And in verse 35 he says, can you send out lightning bolts and they go? Do they report to you? Here we are. You know, after centuries of trying, humans still have no control over the rain and lightning. No more than Job did there when God asked him. He goes on in verse 36 and through 38, and he says, who put wisdom in the heart or gave the mind understanding? Who has the wisdom to number the clouds? Or who can tilt the water jars of heaven when the dust hardens like cast metal and the clods of dirt stick together? You know, God's question implied that neither Job nor any human had the wisdom to control the weather. In a metaphor, the clouds are likened to the giant water jars or water skins, which are tipped to spill the water in the hand into dry soil. Only God can do that. And that's the point, I think, is what really is going on here. God is trying to get the point across to Job that I'm in control. I created this. You might challenge me, but I'll put you in your place. And that's kind of what's going on here when you look at this going back and forth with God asking questions. And if you notice, though, has Job ever answered? Later he will. But when you look at this is almost a one-sided conversation here, with questions but no answer. Next we move to part 2 of our lesson. You know, before I move on to part 2, let's just kind of make note that in this section that we just went over, God shows that Job is utterly helpless in controlling the stars, the clouds, and the lightning. He can't control any of that. As we look at part 2 of our lesson, the title there is God Cares for Animals. God's creation truly reveals His wisdom. You know, take the animals, for instance, if you want to know if He truly has wisdom. Look at how He cared for them, how He created them, how He's provided for them in all things. Now, have you ever been to a wild animal preserve? Anybody, or a big zoo? Been to the zoo a couple of times. You know, I think anybody that has looked at the animals and watched them, or even on television on a lot of the wildlife stations, and you've watched how they live and the things they do, it really amazes us. You wonder how in the world you sit there and watch them just lay back and wait for their prey. Wow. I don't even know if we could live if we had to live like the animals do. In today's generation, I'm really worried if they had to even go back to the time of my parents and grandparents of raising their own food and doing the things they had to do then, if people would make it. They could, but wouldn't. We're a spoiled generation, a lot of the people of today. If you put us out there to live as the animals do, to fend for ourselves, to feed ourselves without the luxuries and the stores to go just handle money and get it, would you survive?
And they don't know
No,
why.
nobody wants to learn it. So if all that's stripped from them, they just die. They'd either learn or they'd die. Huh? That's right. That is for sure. You know, the generations of today really do not realize just how we got it made. Some of us older generation do, because we can look back to things, but a lot of us can't. In earlier defense in the response to his friend Zophar in Job 12, 7 through 10, Job invited Zophar to examine the animals of God's creation, for they have something to teach God's people about God. We can look at the animal creation, the animal kingdom, and we can learn a lot about God and how He has created the animals. Do you think any human being could have created such a creature of any kind? The raven, the lion, the giraffe, or anything else? Just look at His animal creation if you want to know a lot about Him. Let's look now to Job 39, 1 through 13. And like I said, I'm going to read this from the Christian Standard Bible. Do you know when mountain goats give birth? Have you watched the deer in labor? Can you count the months they are pregnant, so you can know the time they give birth? They crouch down to give birth to their young. They deliver their newborn. Their offspring are healthy and grow up in the open field. They leave and do not return. Who set the wild donkey free? Who released the swift donkey from its harness? I made the desert its home, and the salty wasteland its dwelling. It scoffs at the noise of the village and never hears the shouts of the driver. It roams the mountains for its pasture land, searching for anything green. Would the wild ox be willing to serve you? Would it spend the night by your feeding trout? Can you hold the wild ox to a furrow by its harness? Will it plow the valleys behind you? Can you depend on it because its strength is great? Would you leave it to do your hard work? Can you trust the wild ox to harvest your grain and bring it to your threshing floor? The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, but are her feathers and plumage like the stork's? Now these are all questions that God is asking Job here. He wants him to tell him, okay, you're questioning me about my creation. Can you do any of this? Will they do it for you? He says. There's a lot of things that we cannot control that God can. For He is in control of all things of heaven and earth. As we look here at verse 1, it says, do you know when the mountain goats give birth, have you watched the deer in labor? You know, the female mountain goats and the deer are able to reproduce without human help, because that's how God created it. God controls the entire process. As we look at verses 5 through 8, it tells us there, who set the wild donkey free? Who released the swift donkey from its harness? And it goes on to talk about those different things. God implied that He looks after the wild donkey in the desert. We know. Free from the work of the constraints of its domesticated counterpart, the tame donkey. You know, there is a theme here. God has placed every animal in a suitable environment. And that's basically what He's getting at here. He's in control, not the human race. The Hebrew word rendered scoffs could mean laughs or plays. It occurs 6 times in the divine speeches here. It is in verse 7, verse 18, verse 22, and then over in chapter 40, verse 20, and 41, verse 5 and 29. It speaks of scoffing. You know, as we look at verse 9 through 12, it goes on to show that only God could control the powerful wild ox. Now there's ox out there, and there's some that have been used to plow, the tame ox, but there's a big difference in a tame and a wild animal. But even God can control the wild. You know, you may think, well, they've tamed lions, and you've gone to a circus, they're tamed, but look at the times that we've heard mentioned that they were tamed, supposedly, and then they killed somebody. Unlike the domesticated ox, the wild ox could not be harnessed to harvest man's grain, is basically what he's showing here. The Assyrian king, Sennacherib, compared his indomitable courage and strength to that of a wild ox when he spoke. Its long horns were symbolic of strength. A lot of times we think of the longhorn, one of the cows or whatever of Texas, and think of them being stronger than other cows and so forth. And then as we move on, we look here to verse 13. It says, the wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, but her feathers and plumage, are they like the stork's? What do you think of when you think of an ostrich?
I think it's very big over there that they let them. If they can handle it, they can let them.
I don't think of that. I think of this big bird that looks like it's running around like something crazy and sticks its head in the dirt and, or sand and all these kinds of things. And it makes me think of something that's just kind of scattered, is what I think of when I think of an ostrich. Because you see sometimes on the wildlife, they try to catch them or corral them, and here they just go crazy and their wings are everywhere and all of that stuff. And that's the first thing that came to my mind when I thought of that. But think about it. God's even in control of that.
Yes, he is.
Next we look at verses 19, Job 39, verses 19 through 25. Do you give strength to the horse? Now take in mind, this is God speaking to just a human being, Job. He asked him, he says, do you give strength to the horse? Do you adorn his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like a locust? His proud snorting fills one with terror. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He charges into battle. He laughs at fear, since he is afraid of nothing. He does not run from the sword. A quiver rattles of his side, along with a flashing spear and a javelin. It says, when the trumpet blasts, he snorts definitely. He smells the battle from a distance. He hears the officers shout and the battle cry. That basically kind of describes a horse when they're going into battle. Somebody on them, and got their spears and this and that. Is what it kind of describes here. And as we look at that, we go on to see here that the horse was particularly prized and possessed by royalty back in those days, as it shows over in 1 Kings 4:26 and 10:26 through 28. It speaks a little bit of it. The horse's great strength and swiftness made it an important part of ancient military forces, especially in pulling war chariots. The leaping ability of the locust, as well as their appearance and swift orderly advance when swarming, made their comparison with horses a familiar one. The horse's fearlessness and eagerness and confidence in the face of battle is personified as his saying, aha. Yeah, here I come. It was like there wasn't a fear. The rider would tell it to take off and it went. The horse's amazing physical qualities can only be attributed, however, to God, as everything else we've spoken of so far this morning. Not to man. Now, as we look at this, God closed this portion of his questioning of Job in the same way he began it. He challenged Job's understanding about the workings of nature. He began with challenging Job of what he knew and his knowledge of nature, and he ends it the same way. Job had not taught the hawk how to fly or when or where to migrate. The eagle did not build its lofty nest in an inaccessible rocky raging area. Job's direction had nothing to do with all of these animals and what they did. He had no control of it. It's all of God. And that's what God was trying to get across to him when he was trying to challenge God about his creation. Basically, who are you to challenge the Creator who created all things? Is what he's basically placing before Job. When one observes and marvels of all the animal creation, he or she is driven to the realization that the Creator has taken great care for his creation and made provision for its survival. In the New Testament, Jesus memorably referenced God's care for the animal kingdom when he taught his followers not to worry. He said, "Look at the birds. They don't plant or harvest or store food in barns, for your heavenly Father feeds them." He cares for his creation. Aren't we far more valuable to him than they are? It went on to say in Matthew 6:26. God's care for his creation is as far beyond our understanding as it was beyond that of Job at that time when he questioned God about his creation. As we look at part 3 of our lesson, God is sovereign over humankind. That's where we are now. You know, Job 1:1 refers to Job as blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. Yet today's lesson shows us that no matter how much integrity we may have, no matter how well we live our lives, we will have struggles. Indeed, we are no match for the majesty and sovereignty of the power of God, however. And that's something I think that Job learned in this lesson today so far, that he is no match for God, the Creator. He'll never understand fully the creation of the Creator. Let's look first at Job 31. We'll move back a little bit and go to Job 31, verses 1 through 6. He says, "I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look at a young woman? For what portion would I have from God above, or what inheritance from the Almighty on high? Doesn't disaster come to the unjust and misfortune to the evildoers? Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? If I have walked in falsehood, or my foot has rushed to deceit, let God weigh me on accurate scales, and he will recognize my integrity." Now this is Job speaking here. And that's what he's telling us and saying here. You know, as we look at this, basically Job had longed for an audience with God. He mused about what he would do if such an audience was granted to him. What do you think you would do if you had an audience with God today? You know, he wanted this audience, and he was granted it, saying, "I would lay out my case and present my arguments." Would you lay out your case and present your arguments before God? You know, then I would listen to his reply and understand what he says to me. Would he use his great power to argue with me? No. He would give me a fair hearing. Job 23, 4 through 6. You know, Job recognized the sovereignty of God over creation and was confident that he could state his case before God. You know, it's ever proper for people to ask questions of God. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. God has created us with the capacity to think and to reason. And he would expect, I think, us to ask questions. I think where Job messed up is his questions became accusations, basically. His questions became accusations against God and his creation and why, and basically questioning God's creation. The Creator knows all. He is all-knowing. We are just a mere creature of his creation. Who are we to question what he has created? You know, Job began the final defense of his purity by declaring that he had never even looked at a young woman lustfully. The eyes were considered basically in those days the gateway to the inner person, which it is today. A lot of times your eyes can get you in trouble. You see something you want, you're on a diet, you go and get it. No, know, or it may even be that you go to the lot, you see a nice car, and you've already got a good one, but you want that one, so you get yourself in trouble and go a little further in debt for something because it looks really good to you. The eyes can do a lot of things. They can play tricks on you. But Job is saying, he hadn't done this. The eyes were, in those days, considered the gateway to the inner person. The wandering eye, if you want to think about it, got Samson in trouble in Judges 16:1. His eyes got him in trouble. That's right. The wandering eye got Samson in trouble. It got David in trouble, as you can see from 2 Samuel 11:2-3. It got him into serious trouble, and Jesus warned of its dangers. Job's covenant language underscored the seriousness of his purpose and his binding self-limitation, basically. Job posed 3 questions emphasizing God's dealing with him. Should he violate his covenant not to lust after the young woman? The metaphor of where one's foot walks expresses proper conduct. The weighing of a man in the scales was a test of character, basically, in those days. The last part of our lesson goes on now to where God answers Job. Job was about to get the audience with God that he wanted, but he realized that his confidence in his own defense before God was sadly lacking when compared to the wisdom and the sovereignty of God. We lack in wisdom and knowledge of the creation. Job had desired to have a conversation with God, but God silenced all of Job's protests with one thundering question and challenge. Do you still want to argue with the Almighty? After what I've read here of Job, I don't think I do. Are we God's critic? If we are, do we have the answers? Neither did Job. Job had desired to have a conversation with God, but like I said, he was silenced. If you look at Job 40:2, he says, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? We tend with him. We didn't create him, he created us. Will we tend to correct him? God had been bringing Job basically to a place of realization that he lacked the insight and the wisdom to question the sovereignty of God. We all lack that wisdom and that insight to the creation of the Creator. Who are we to question the Creator of all things? Somehow Job failed to realize that in his defense, he had actually made accusations against God, the Creator. We need to be careful when we ask questions of God, not to accuse. Through the course of chapters 41 and 42, God continued to present his matchless power and wisdom revealed in his creation. This served to drive home the gravity of Job's offense. The creature has no right to demand that the Creator give an account of himself. And that's all we are. We are just creatures of the creation. A small fraction of God's creation. We have no right to question the Creator. When God was finished, all Job could do was acknowledge him as the sovereign Lord. All that was left for Job to do was to repent. I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my eyes. I take back everything I said, and I sit in dust and ashes to show my repentance. Job 42:5-6. And that's what we must do sometimes, is to sit back and do as Job, put our hand over our mouth, sit in silence, and repent of our actions, of our thoughts. And I think that taught us a lot about God's creation, the Creator, and where we stand. Next week we'll move on and we'll talk a little bit about our responsibility of God's creation. Thanks for being with us.
job this morning.
Yes, it is.
Certainly needs glory.
Message, it was. How you doing?
Oh, pretty good.
You drive?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you did.
Oh,
Where's Susie?
you will understand. I want to try this to back.
Oh, up in Cersei. Is that her name? Marianna? Yeah.
How's David doing?
He's doing okay. He had to have a shot put in his eyes this week.
Oh, I don't know.
They're going to do it once a month. Well, they're going to do it again next month. It's not together. It's all together.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, his sugar's running up high this month for 2. Well, mine was 202.
This man is really wild.
Yeah, he don't drive at all anymore.
Good morning, pretty thing, pretty girl.
Good morning there, young lady.
You have a good vacation? How are you doing? You asleep up here? He really is asleep. You asleep?
Oh,
Oh, we're so strong.